The divorce papers arrived before the placenta. Dina Evans lay on the delivery bed, sweat-soaked and trembling, as nurses counted tiny fingers and toes across 3 separate warming stations. Monitors beeped in overlapping rhythms. Someone said, "Beautiful," and someone else said, "Breathing well." Dina turned her head toward the sound of expensive leather shoes on linoleum. Hermann Muller stood beside her bed, impeccable in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that hadn't creased despite the 5-hour wait. His hair was slicked back perfectly, not a strand out of place. He wasn't holding flowers or reaching for her hand. He was holding a blue legal folder. "Sign it, Dina," he said, his voice as flat as a board meeting. "The settlement is generous, provided you leave the city by morning." Before we continue with the story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. Oh, and drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. We love seeing that Dina blinked, her vision still blurred from exhaustion. "What?" "The divorce," Herman clarified, as if explaining a simple contract clause to an intern. He placed the folder on the white hospital sheets right beside her thigh. "My attorney drew it up 3 days ago. I've already signed." One of the nurses froze mid-swaddle, staring. Another pretended not to hear, suddenly very focused on the infant in her arms. Dina's heart rate spiked on the monitor. The OBGYN looked up from her notes, alarmed. "Mr. Muller, this is highly inappropriate." "This is a private matter," Herman interrupted smoothly. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. "And technically, visiting hours are over." The doctor's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. No one challenged Herman Muller, not in this hospital, where his name was engraved on the pediatric wing. Dina tried to push herself upright, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Her arms shook. "Herman, I just gave birth to your children." "That's the problem," he said softly, almost kindly, as if comforting a child who didn't understand why they couldn't keep the stray dog. "I never wanted children, Dina. You knew that. You trapped me." The words landed like ice water. "You're getting the apartment in Brooklyn," he continued, flipping open the folder with one manicured finger. 12 months of alimony. After that, you're on your own. The triplets stay with you. I'm waiving all parental rights. Clean break. You can't just, I can and I have." He slid a pen onto the folder. Mont Blanc, the one she'd bought him for their first anniversary. "Sign now, or my legal team files contested custody in the morning. You'll spend every dollar you don't have fighting me in court. And you'll lose." Dina stared at him. At the man she'd loved, married, built a life around. His blue eyes were calm, distant, like he was reviewing quarterly projections. There was no anger, no guilt, just efficiency. She looked past him at the 3 tiny bundles, each smaller than a loaf of bread, each helpless and new and hers. Her hand trembled as she took the pen. Herman smiled, not warmly, just satisfied. Smart choice. He didn't wait for her to finish signing. He took the folder, checked the signature line, and snapped it shut. Then he walked out without looking back, his phone already pressed to his ear. "Belle," she heard him say as the door swung closed. "It's done. I'll be at your place in 20. By the time Dina was discharged 2 days later, the locks on their penthouse had been changed. Her belongings were waiting in storage. The joint accounts were frozen. The car service she called told her Mr. Muller had canceled her authorization. She stood on the curb outside Lenox Hill Hospital with 3 car seats, 2 diaper bags, and $47 in cash. The December wind cut through her coat. One of the babies started crying, then the second, then the third, a cascading chorus of need. The cab driver slowed, saw the triple strollers, and sped up again. Dina felt the tears coming, hot and furious, but she swallowed them down. She couldn't afford to break. Not yet. She pulled out her phone and searched for motels near the bus line. What Dina didn't know, what Herman didn't know, what no one in that sterile, beeping hospital knew, was that 400 miles away, in a marble-floored law office overlooking the Potomac, a man named Lucas Trent was reviewing a file marked Urgent, Evans' lineage confirmed. And the woman Herman Mueller had just discarded like expired stock was about to inherit the one thing he valued most: power. They wheeled her to the curb in a chair that still smelled of antiseptic and latex, a plastic hospital bracelet digging into her wrist. The nurse helped her stand, then passed her the first carrier, then the second, then the third, murmuring something that was meant to be encouraging and landed like static. When the automatic doors slid shut behind her, the warmth of the lobby vanished. December air slapped her open incision through the thin fabric of the discharge gown hidden under her coat. Dina balanced one carrier on the curb while she fumbled for her phone. She opened the car service app, thumb clumsy with exhaustion, and ordered the same black town car Herman always used. The confirmation screen flashed, then vanished. Payment declined. She tried again with a different card. Same message. She checked her banking app. Every shared account showed a neat red 0. The private savings she thought she had. Access restricted. Please contact your administrator. Administrator, Herman. A yellow cab slowed as if to take pity on her. Then the driver caught sight of 3 infant seats and shook his head, pulling away. Dina laughed once, a sharp, humorless sound that startled a passing volunteer. It took 20 minutes to figure out the bus route and another 10 to maneuver 3 carriers up the narrow steps, while the driver watched in the mirror, but did not offer to help. Strangers stared, some with sympathy, some with annoyance, as she wedged herself into the sideways seat, metal bar pressing against her ribs. One baby whimpered, then another. She rocked all 3 with a foot braced against the floor and a hand hooked through plastic handles. By the time she reached the gated street of the mansion, her stitches burned and her legs shook. The guard at the front booth avoided her eyes when she approached, carriers digging into her palms. Mrs. Mueller. It's Dina, she cut in. Open the gate. His jaw worked. I got new instructions this morning. Authorized residents only. She stared at the biometric panel, at the familiar black steel that had once meant safety. You're joking. I'm sorry, ma'am. The intercom crackled when he tried the house line. No answer. Of course not. Herman was probably already at Bell's, drinking something aged and expensive, celebrating his clean slate. Dina swallowed the bile rising in her throat. Fine. She turned away from the house she'd decorated, the house where she'd planned a nursery that was now probably being painted over. Her entire life fit into 3 plastic shells and a hospital-issued tote bag. Back at the bus stop, she searched for a cheap motel near me and chose the one with the fewest bedbug complaints. The room she ended up in had a flickering neon sign outside the thin curtains and a carpet that smelled like old smoke and lemon cleaner. She laid the babies on the sagging mattress, one by one, and sank to the floor because sitting on the bed made her incision scream. For a long time, she watched the red vacancy sign blinking through the fabric, casting the room in a pulsing, bloody glow. This was what he'd left her with. $57 in cash, 3 tiny lives, and a body held together by stitches and stubbornness. Dina pressed her palms to her burning eyes. This was the bottom. Good. It meant there was nowhere to go now but up. The supermarket's fluorescence buzzed like trapped flies, bleaching the world into sickly white. Dina stood in the baby aisle with a wire basket hooked over her forearm, counting out crumpled bills and coins in her palm. A can of formula waited on the shelf in front of her, smug in its shiny label and cheerful promises. She checked the price again, then the total on her mental calculator. Rent, bus fare back to the motel, maybe one pack of diapers if she skipped dinner. Her stomach growled. She ignored it. Behind her, a kid in a puffy jacket crashed a cart into his mother's legs. Somewhere near the registers, an impatient beep, beep, beep kept time with the throbbing at Dina's incision. She closed her fingers over the coins, feeling the sticky residue of old soda on the dime, and reached for the smallest can. "Don't do that." The voice was low, smooth, carrying easily over the hum of the store. Dina stiffened. For a second, panic flared. Herman. But when she turned, the man standing at the end of the aisle was no one she recognized. Tailored navy suit, charcoal overcoat open despite the cold. No tie. He looked wildly out of place between the generic diapers and off-brand wipes, like he'd stepped out of a boardroom and into a bad dream. Dark hair, neatly cut. A face that would photograph well. Strong jaw, straight nose. The kind of mouth that knew how to close on a deal. But it was his eyes that made her breath hitch. They were the same sharp blue she saw every time she passed a mirror. The same color her triplets stared up at her with when they weren't screaming. He studied her for a beat, gaze moving from the hospital bracelet still on her wrist to the cheap coat, to the formula she was about to settle for. Then back to her eyes, like he was confirming a hypothesis. "Ms. Evans?" he asked. Her fingers tightened on the basket handle. "Do I know you?" "Not yet." He stepped closer, careful, like she was a skittish animal that might bolt. The faintest hint of cologne, cedar and something darker, cut through the supermarket smell. He reached into his coat and produced a sleek black wallet, flipping it open to show an ID badge she couldn't fully parse. "My name is Lucas Trent. I'm an attorney for the Vanguard Trust." Dina almost laughed. "If this is about debt collection, you're wasting your time." "This isn't about debt." He glanced at the formula in her hand, and something like anger flickered across his features, there and gone. "It's about inheritance." She stared. The word didn't fit the life she was living, not with motel sheets and vending machine dinners. "You've got the wrong person." He shook his head. "There's only one person in the city with those eyes and that name." He slid a crisp envelope from inside his coat and extended it to her. Her name, her full name, Dina Alexandra Evans, was printed on the front in precise black ink. "You are the sole surviving blood heir of the Vanguard family. Effective as of last week, you control Vanguard Logistics and its affiliated holdings." The basket slipped from her arm and crashed to the linoleum, coins scattering like shot. "What did you just say?" Lucas didn't flinch at the stares from the other shoppers, at the quarter that rolled to his shoe. He simply held her gaze, steady and certain. "I'm saying," he replied quietly, "that the woman counting change for formula is, on paper, one of the wealthiest people in the country. And my job is to make sure you live long enough to enjoy it." The penthouse smelled like money. Not the new car, credit card kind Herman used to flaunt, but the old kind. The quiet kind that didn't need to announce itself. Marble floors stretched toward floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the East River. Dina's reflection in the glass looked like a ghost, pale and hollow-eyed, still wearing the same coat, She'd been discharged 4 days ago. Behind her, 3 professional nannies moved through the space with the efficiency of surgical teams, tending to the triplets in a nursery that had appeared overnight, complete with imported cribs and a sound system that played something classical and soothing. Dina had protested at first, insisted she could manage alone, but Lucas had simply looked at her with those unsettling blue eyes and asked if she wanted revenge or exhaustion. She chose revenge. Now she sat across from him at a glass table stacked with contracts, corporate filings, and leather-bound books, with titles like Hostile Takeovers, A Legal Framework, and The Art of Corporate War. Lucas slid a document toward her, tapping a highlighted section with his pen. Vanguard Logistics owns the shipping infrastructure for 70% of the eastern seaboard, he explained, voice calm and clinical. Rail, freight, warehousing. If a product moves from port to distribution, we touch it. Your grandfather built this empire before the internet existed. It's analog power in a digital age, which makes it nearly invisible. Dina scanned the page, her brain still catching up to words like subsidiary and controlling interest. The stylist Lucas had hired earlier that day had transformed her hair into smooth, golden waves that caught the light. Her nails were filed and polished. The cashmere sweater she wore cost more than a month's rent at the motel. She looked like the woman in the mirror again. The one she'd forgotten existed. Why didn't anyone tell me? She asked, not looking up from the contract. About my family. About this. Lucas hesitated just for a second. Your mother left the family before you were born. Cut all ties. Your grandfather spent 20 years searching for her, and by the time we found you, he'd already passed. The estate's been in probate. Until now. Dina flipped to the next page and froze. There, buried in a subsidiary breakdown under primary corporate accounts receivable, was a name that made her pulse spike. Muller Corp. She looked up sharply. Lucas was already watching her, a faint, knowing curve to his mouth. Herman owes Vanguard $43 million, he said softly. Secured against his voting shares. The loan comes due in 6 months. Dina stared at the numbers, at the signature on the bottom of the original contract. Herman's handwriting, bold and careless, like he'd never imagined the lender might one day have a face. Her face. She set the document down carefully, fingers steady now, and met Lucas's gaze. Teach me everything. The rooftop bar glowed gold against the city's glass and steel horizon, heaters blasting warm air over a crowd of men in suits and women in dresses that cost more than mid-range cars. Herman lifted his champagne flute as the CFO finished his speech. The words, record quarter and unprecedented growth, floating over the speakers to polite laughter and applause. A banner on the projection screen behind them read, Muller Corp. Stronger than ever. Herman believed it. He liked the way the numbers looked on the slides, up and to the right, lines like rocket launches. He liked the way investors clapped his shoulder and told him he had vision. He liked the way Belle Knox leaned in at his side, red lips grazing his ear as she whispered, You did it, baby. What he didn't like, and therefore didn't bother with tonight, were the footnotes. Somewhere far below, buried in the finance department, a junior analyst had flagged a growing liability column tied to a single creditor. The report had been forwarded, then softened, then spun into manageable exposure. Herman had skimmed the first page, seen the name Vanguard, and shrugged. Old money, old agreements. They'd renew. They always did. Debt was just leverage with better PR. He raised his glass higher, basking in the light of his own legend. Across town, in a quieter office lined with screens instead of skyline views, Dina watched a different set of numbers. She sat at the head of a sleek conference table, hair pulled back, blazer sharp as a blade. On the monitor in front of her, the ticker for Mueller Corp flickered in real time, tiny dips and rises like a heartbeat on a monitor. Float is about 12%, Lucas said from beside her, sleeves rolled, tie loosened. Institutionals are steady. The retail traders follow sentiment, not math. If we move in small blocks over several weeks under separate entities, no one blinks. A list of shell companies scrolled down the screen, each with its own generic name, each tied by a web of paperwork back to Vanguard and, ultimately, to her. To them, Lucas continued, you're just a collection of faceless funds, a whisper in a crowded room. Dina watched as another small order executed, adding to their quietly growing position. Vanguard already held Herman's debt. Now she wanted his pride. How much do we have? She asked. 3%, Lucas replied, across accounts. Too visible? Not if you don't flinch. His mouth tilted. And he won't either. He'll assume it's noise, algorithms, people chasing momentum. On the rooftop, an associate approached Herman with a tablet, murmuring something about minor fluctuations in the closing price. Herman glanced at the chart, saw the small increase in volume, the slightly heavier buying on the dips. Bots, he said, handing the tablet back, or some fund repositioning for year-end. As long as it's going up, let them play. He wrapped an arm around Belle's waist and steered her toward the photographer, angling his face to catch the light. In the office, another green notification blinked across Dina's screen. Order filled. Her shares, her company, her move. She folded her hands, pulse steady. Keep buying, she said. The project was bleeding money like a severed artery, and Herman's CFO had stopped pretending otherwise. The Bridgeport logistics hub, the crown jewel of Mueller Corp's expansion plan, sat half-finished on contaminated soil that the environmental report had somehow missed. Remediation would cost $30 million. The original lender had pulled out. The board wanted answers Herman didn't have. He needed a bridge loan, fast and quiet, before the quarterly earnings call exposed the wound. His assistant made the call to Vanguard on a Tuesday morning, requesting an in-person meeting with the CEO. Herman expected the usual dance, a lunch reservation at Per Se, handshakes, assurances that men like them understood how business worked. Partnership, flexibility, trust. The response came back in an email 2 hours later, clinical and brief. Vanguard declines in-person meetings at this time. Attached, please find loan terms for your review. Herman frowned at the screen, then opened the attachment. The contract was dense, 30 pages of legal language that made his eyes glaze. He forwarded it to his general counsel with a single line. How fast can we close this? The lawyer called him 20 minutes later, voice tight. Herman, these terms are aggressive. The interest rate is manageable, but the covenants are restrictive. If you miss a single payment, or if your debt-to-equity ratio crosses a specific threshold, Vanguard gets immediate conversion rights on your voting shares. Herman leaned back in his chair, watching the skyline through his office window. What's the threshold? 0.95. We're at 0.7. Today, the lawyer said carefully. But if the Bridgeport project stalls further, or if revenue dips, it won't. Herman cut him off, already bored with the hedging. We're 1/4 away from the biggest contract in company history. I need $30 million now to keep the board calm and the stock steady. Vanguard gets paid back in 6 months with interest. Everyone wins. Silence on the other end, then a sigh. I'll draft the acceptance. The The contract came back signed the next day, couriered in a black leather portfolio with the Vanguard logo embossed in silver. Herman barely glanced at the signature page before adding his own name in bold strokes. Across town, Lucas set the countersigned document on Dina's desk. She sat in the low light of her office, reading the clause she'd insisted he include, the one Herman's lawyer had warned him about and that Herman had dismissed. Conversion of voting shares upon default, she read aloud, voice soft. Immediate and irrevocable. Lucas nodded. One missed payment, and you control 51% of Mueller Corp. Dina traced the edge of the page with her finger, lingering on Herman's signature. The same handwriting that had signed divorce papers on her hospital bed now signed away the one thing he valued more than money. Control. She closed the folder. Now we wait. Herman, meanwhile, authorized the wire transfer for the Bridgeport remediation and told his assistant to book him a table at his favorite steakhouse. The crisis was over. The board would stop panicking. Bell would stop asking if they needed to postpone the European trip. Everything, he thought, was exactly as it should be. The Metropolitan Museum's Temple of Dendur glowed under amber lighting, the ancient stone reflecting in the shallow pool that stretched between champagne-carrying donors and a string quartet playing something timeless and forgettable. Herman moved through the crowd with Belle at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her dress cut low enough to draw attention, but high enough to maintain plausible deniability. Cameras flashed. A society columnist asked about the Bridgeport project. Herman smiled and said all the right words, the ones that sounded like answers without committing to anything. He felt good tonight. Powerful. The kind of man who belonged in rooms like this, where the tickets cost more than most people's rent and the art was older than the country. Near the bar, he caught sight of a woman standing alone. She wore a floor-length gown in midnight blue, simple and devastating. The kind that didn't need embellishment because the body underneath did all the work. Her hair fell in soft waves over one shoulder, catching the light like spun gold. But it was her profile that made him pause mid-conversation, champagne glass halfway to his lips. Something about the angle of her jaw, the way she held herself, spine straight, chin slightly lifted. He knew that posture. Babe? Belle's voice cut through his thoughts, irritation sharpening the edges. You're staring. Herman blinked, pulling his focus back. I'm networking. But when he looked again, the woman had turned slightly, and the light caught her eyes. Blue. Sharp. Familiar in a way that sent a cold finger down his spine. For half a second, his brain offered him a name, a face, a hospital bed. Then logic stepped in. Dina was gone. Broke. Probably in some rundown apartment struggling to afford diapers. She wouldn't be here, in a gown that cost 5 figures, moving through a room full of Manhattan's elite like she belonged. Impossible. He turned back to Belle, forcing a smile. Let's get closer to the podium. I want to be seen when they announce the donations. Across the room, Dina watched him go. She hadn't worn a mask, though Lucas had offered one. She didn't need to hide. Herman's brain wouldn't let him see her here, not in this context, not dressed like someone who mattered. Cognitive dissonance was a gift. She lifted her glass, the champagne bubbling gold against the light, and allowed herself the smallest smile. He'd looked right at her, and he'd looked away. Lucas appeared at her elbow, seamless and unobtrusive. Enjoying the show? Immensely, Dina murmured, still watching Herman glad hand a board member near the sculpture. He has no idea. Good, Lucas replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Let's keep it that way. For now. On the far side of the temple, Herman laughed at someone's joke, loud and confident, the sound echoing off stone that had survived empires. Dina set her glass down on a passing tray and turned toward the exit. She'd seen enough. The shipment was supposed to arrive on the 14th. Critical components for the Bridgeport project, the ones Herman needed to demonstrate progress before the quarterly board meeting. The ones that would justify the $30 million he'd borrowed and keep the stock price from tanking when earnings were announced. The containers sat in a rail yard in Newark instead, delayed by what the logistics company called routine inspections and prioritization adjustments. Nothing illegal, nothing Herman could sue over. Just a bureaucratic hiccup that happened to cost him 72 hours he didn't have. His CFO called on the 16th, voice strained. "We're going to miss the Vanguard payment. It's due tomorrow, and the Bridgeport milestone bonus won't hit the account until the components clear customs." Herman gripped his phone harder. "How much are we short?" $2.3 million. "That's nothing," Herman snapped. "Call Vanguard. Explain the delay. They'll extend 48 hours. It's standard practice." The CFO hesitated. "I already tried. They said the contract doesn't allow extensions. Payment is due in full by end of business tomorrow, or the default provisions activate immediately." Herman felt something cold settle in his chest, but he pushed it aside. This was posturing. Lenders didn't blow up relationships over technicalities. Then move money from operating reserves. "We can't. The covenants restrict cash transfers if our debt-to-equity crosses 0.95. We hit 0.96 this morning when the stock dipped on the delay rumors." The coldness spread. Herman hung up and called his lawyer, then his banker, then anyone who might float him a short-term bridge. But the market had already smelled blood in the water. No one wanted to touch Mueller Corp until the Vanguard situation resolved. The payment didn't clear. At 5:01 p.m. the following day, an email arrived from Vanguard's legal department, formatted in the clean, emotionless language of corporate executions. Pursuant to Section 8.3 of the loan agreement, borrower is in material default. Lender hereby exercises its right to convert outstanding debt to voting equity. Effective immediately, Vanguard Trust holds 51% controlling interest in Mueller Corp. Herman read it 3 times, each pass making the words sharper. Controlling interest. His board of directors received the same email 6 minutes later, along with a formal notice calling an emergency meeting in 72 hours to introduce the new majority shareholder. Herman stared at his screen, jaw tight, pulse hammering in his temples. Whoever ran Vanguard had just taken his company, and he didn't even know their name. The calendar invite arrived next. Emergency board meeting, introduction of majority shareholder. Location, Mueller Corp headquarters, executive boardroom. Time, Monday, 10:00 a.m. Herman forwarded the invite to his attorney with a single line. "Find out who the hell I'm meeting." The response came back an hour later, unhelpful and maddening. Vanguard's ownership structure is private. CEO identity is not publicly disclosed. Monday morning, Herman would sit across from a stranger and beg them not to destroy everything he'd built. He just didn't know yet that the stranger had already memorized every word she planned to say. The boardroom smelled like expensive wood polish and fear. Herman sat at the head of the long table, fingers drumming against the armrest of the leather chair he'd commissioned 3 years ago when the company went public. Around him, the board members shifted in their seats, checking phones, whispering to one another in tones that made his jaw tighten. No one looked at him directly. His lawyer sat to his right, briefcase open, contract printouts fanned across the mahogany. "We argue hardship," the man had said that morning. "Unforeseen delays. We negotiate a payment plan, maybe offer additional collateral." Herman nodded, but his collar felt too tight. He'd rehearsed the talking points, the ones that framed him as a victim of circumstance rather than a man who'd bet everything on his own invincibility. The door to the boardroom opened. Heads turned. Herman straightened, preparing his most diplomatic smile for whatever faceless executive vanguard had sent to claim their prize. Then Dina walked in. For 3 full seconds, his brain refused to process it. She wore a charcoal suit tailored to precision, heels that clicked against the floor with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Her hair was swept back, makeup subtle but flawless. She looked nothing like the exhausted woman he'd left bleeding in a hospital bed 4 months ago. Herman laughed, a short, confused bark of sound that echoed in the silence. "Dina?" He glanced at security, then back at her. Smile still plastered on his face, like this was some elaborate prank. "How did you even get clearance to be in here?" She didn't answer. She walked the length of the table, her eyes never leaving his, and stopped directly behind the chair he was sitting in. "Stand up, Herman," she said quietly. His smile faltered. "Excuse me?" "I didn't need clearance," Dina continued, her voice calm, surgical. "I own the building. I own this company. And you're sitting in my chair." The room went silent. One of the board members inhaled sharply. Herman stared at her, the words landing but not connecting, like a puzzle missing pieces. "What are you talking about?" Lucas entered behind her, carrying a leather portfolio. He set it on the table in front of the board, flipping it open to reveal documents with the Vanguard logo, embossed across the top. "Ms. Evans is the sole owner and CEO of Vanguard Trust," Lucas said, his tone clinical. "As of last week, Vanguard holds 51% of Mueller Corp's voting shares, which makes her the controlling stakeholder, and your boss." Herman's face drained of color. He looked from Lucas to Dina, then back to the documents, searching for the trick, the loophole, the mistake. There wasn't one. Dina leaned forward, resting her hands on the back of the chair. "You can stand, Herman, or security can help you. Your choice." He stood slowly, legs unsteady, moving aside like a man in a dream. Dina slid into the seat, adjusting it slightly, and folded her hands on the table. The board stared at her, some confused, some calculating, all silent. "Let's begin," she said. "First item, executive leadership. I'm removing Herman Mueller as CEO, effective immediately, for gross financial mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty." Herman's lawyers shot to his feet. "You can't." "I can," Dina interrupted, her gaze never leaving Herman. "And I am. Security will escort you out. You have 1 hour to clear your office." Herman's mouth opened, but no sound came. She smiled then, just slightly, the same smile he'd given her when he dropped the divorce papers on her hospital bed. "Clean break," she said softly. The headlines hit within the hour. Billionaire CEO ousted by mystery heiress. Mueller Corp takeover. Ex-wife's revenge or business genius. By nightfall, Herman's face was plastered across financial news networks, grainy footage of him being escorted from his own building by security, briefcase in one hand, the other shielding his face from cameras. The board of directors who'd once applauded his vision released a carefully worded statement distancing themselves from his reckless financial decisions. Investors who toasted him at rooftop bars now refused his calls. Belle Knox changed her relationship status to single and booked a one-way ticket to Monaco. Herman was left with a severance package Lucas had drafted personally, enough to avoid total destitution, not enough to rebuild an empire. His reputation, the one thing he'd valued above money, above family, above everything, was ash. Dina stood in the executive office that used to be his, watching the city lights blink on as dusk settled over Manhattan. The room had been stripped of Herman's oversized desk and ego-feeding awards. In their place, clean lines, functional elegance, a wall of screens tracking logistics networks that spanned continents. The brass nameplate outside the door read, Evans Vanguard Industries. Her company now, her legacy. Behind her, the door opened softly. Lucas stepped in, sleeves rolled, tie loosened the way he always wore it by the end of long days. The press team wants a statement, something about your vision for the company. Dina turned from the window. Tell them we're focused on sustainable growth and ethical leadership, nothing fancy. He nodded, but didn't leave. You did it, he said quietly. She smiled just a little. We did it. The penthouse apartment that evening smelled like lavender and baby shampoo. The triplets, 14 months old now and dangerously mobile, toddled across the living room rug in pajamas covered with cartoon dinosaurs. One grabbed at Lucas's pant leg, giggling. He scooped the child up with the ease of someone who'd done it 100 times before. Dina stood beside him at the floor-to-ceiling windows, her hand finding his. Below them, the city sprawled in a glittering grid of light and possibility. A kingdom built on shipping routes and steel and the kind of patience that only came from knowing what it felt like to have nothing. They'll grow up knowing they're safe, Lucas said, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. Dina watched her children chase each other in circles, their laughter high and bright and free. She thought of the motel room with its flickering neon sign, the bus ride with 3 carriers and $57, the moment she'd believed she'd hit bottom. She'd been wrong. That wasn't the bottom. It was the foundation. They'll grow up knowing they're powerful, Dina corrected, squeezing his hand. There's a difference. Outside, the city hummed with the movement of goods and money and ambition, all of it flowing through networks she now controlled. Herman was somewhere out there too, smaller now, forgettable, learning what it felt like to be erased. Dina turned away from the window as one of the triplets crashed into her legs, demanding to be picked up. She lifted her daughter into her arms, kissed her forehead, and carried her toward the others. The view could wait. Her legacy was right here. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.